Princess Anne had uncovered something connected to Queen Camilla's family that the palace had never expected anyone to find, and those closest to the royal household understood immediately that once the discovery became impossible to ignore, 30 years of carefully maintained silence would finally begin to collapse. What made the moment extraordinary was not simply what the documents contained. It was the realization that someone had made a deliberate decision, decades earlier, to ensure those documents would never be seen. The question nobody could yet answer was who had authorized that decision and how far up the chain of royal authority the knowledge had actually reached. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a royal investigation like this one. What Princess Anne uncovered reaches far deeper than the headlines have yet been told. But to understand what she found inside that folder, we first need to witness the exact moment the discovery was made, because the reaction in that room told its own story before a single word had been spoken. The afternoon had begun without any indication that something extraordinary was about to happen. A small team of royal archivists had gathered inside a private office at one of the estate properties connected to the royal household. The task before them was routine, a standard institutional review of historical family documentation, the kind of quiet administrative work that takes place regularly behind palace walls and almost never attracts attention. Princess Anne had been present for similar reviews before. She understood the process. She trusted the people involved. There was no reason to expect the afternoon would produce anything beyond the usual collection of carefully organized records, cross-referenced files, and administrative correspondence stretching back through decades of royal history. Then a folder was placed before her. It appeared unremarkable at first, aged but intact. The kind of document storage that survives institutional archives simply because nobody ever found a reason to remove it. Anne opened it without hesitation. The first page was straightforward. Background material. Context, she already understood. The second page made her stop. She read it once, then returned to the beginning and read it again. More slowly this time. Her eyes moved across the text with the particular focus of someone who has encountered something they cannot immediately reconcile with what they already know. The archivist sitting closest to her later recalled that the room felt different within seconds. Not because of anything dramatic. No raised voice. No sudden movement. Simply a quality of stillness that had not been there before. The kind of stillness that arrives when a person of considerable self-discipline encounters something that genuinely shakes them. What the folder contained was a document dated 30 years earlier. An internal memo, brief in length but precise in its language, referencing a family matter connected directly to Camilla's background, a branch of the Parker Bowles family history that had never been formally discussed within official royal circles. The memo bore the signature of a senior royal official, whose name Princess Anne recognized without difficulty. Someone who had occupied a position of genuine institutional authority during one of the most turbulent periods in modern royal history. The memo did not read like an oversight. It read like a decision, carefully worded, deliberately vague in certain passages, yet clear enough in its intent for anyone familiar with how palace communications operated during that era to understand exactly what had been agreed upon and exactly what had been chosen to remain unrecorded anywhere else. Anne placed the folder down on the table. For a moment, she said nothing. The archivists exchanged glances without speaking. Then she asked a single question. She wanted to know where the folder had been stored before it arrived in that room, and how long it had remained in that location without being reviewed. The answer she received extended the silence considerably. Because the folder had not been misfiled. It had not been overlooked by accident. According to the records, it had been placed in a specific location within the archive system many years earlier, and had remained untouched ever since, as though someone had placed it there with the full expectation that it would never need to be opened again. But Princess Anne had not yet seen the second document, and the second document was the one that would make her reach for the phone. Princess Anne did not share what she had found immediately. That was not unusual for her. She had spent decades navigating situations that required restraint before reaction, and the instinct to process privately before speaking publicly was one of the qualities those closest to her respected most. But the people around her that afternoon noticed something. They could not quite name a shift in her manner that lingered long after the review session had concluded, and the archivists had quietly gathered their materials, left. She returned to her schedule the following morning. Appointments kept. Engagements attended. The composed, purposeful exterior that had defined her public life for half a century remained firmly in place. Yet something had changed behind it. A member of her household staff described the days that followed as unusually quiet. Not tense in any obvious way, simply quieter than normal. The kind of quiet that settles around a person who is carrying something they have not yet decided how to put down. The difficulty was not merely what the document contained. It was what it implied about people she had trusted. Princess Anne had always maintained a relationship with the institution of the monarchy that was perhaps more straightforward than those of her siblings. She believed in duty. She believed in discretion. She believed that the private obligations of royal life were inseparable from its public ones. That belief had served her well through decades of complicated family history. It had helped her navigate situations that would have broken people with less internal discipline. But what the folder suggested could not be easily reconciled with those beliefs. Because if the memo was genuine, and she had little reason to doubt it, then a decision of genuine consequence had been made by senior figures within the royal household, without proper documentation, without appropriate disclosure, and without the knowledge of at least some of the people most directly affected by it. That realization carried a particular kind of weight. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla appeared that same week at a scheduled public engagement. Those present described her as characteristically warm, engaged, attentive to the people around her. There was nothing in her manner to suggest she was aware that anything had shifted. She moved through the afternoon with the ease of someone whose conscience was entirely untroubled, which created its own painful complexity. Because Anne was now in possession of information connected directly to Camilla's family, information whose implications reached into the present, and Camilla herself appeared to know nothing about it. King Charles received a carefully worded communication from his sister shortly afterward. Those aware of its contents described his response as measured, calm in the way that Charles had learned, over many years, to be calm when situations required it, rather than when they deserved it. He asked 2 questions. The first concerned the source of the document. The second concerned who else had seen it. Then, according to those briefed on the exchange, he said very little for the remainder of that conversation. It was the silence afterward that told the fuller story. Because none of them yet understood how deeply this had already begun, or how far back the story truly reached. To understand why the document existed at all, it was necessary to go back, not to a public moment, not to anything recorded in official histories or captured by cameras or discussed in the parliamentary briefings that shaped the public understanding of that era, but to a private gathering that took place far from London during one of the most delicate periods the British monarchy had navigated in living memory. The early 1990s had placed the royal family under a pressure unlike anything the modern institution had previously experienced. The marriage between Charles and Diana had collapsed in full public view. Newspapers carried details that palace officials would previously have considered impossible to print. Public trust in the monarchy had entered a period of genuine fragility. Every decision made within those walls carried consequences that extended far beyond the family itself. It was precisely during this period that a quiet meeting took place. The location was a private estate outside London. Nothing about it appeared remarkable from the outside. The kind of property that attracts no attention because it was never intended to. A place chosen specifically because conversations held there would remain exactly that, conversations. Unrecorded. Unwitnessed by anyone not directly invited. Those present included a senior member of Camilla's extended family and at least 2 individuals who occupied positions of formal authority within the royal household at that time. The meeting had not been arranged through official channels. No entry appeared in any diary that would later become subject to institutional review. The gathering existed, for all practical purposes, only in the memories of the people who attended it. What brought them together was a matter that had surfaced unexpectedly, a detail connected to Camilla's family background that carried potential legal implications. Not criminal in nature, nothing of that kind, but significant enough, given the extraordinary sensitivity of the moment, to create serious concern among those who understood how the institution operated and what it could not afford to absorb. The detail itself related to a formal legal process quietly undertaken by a member of Camilla's extended family during that period. Under normal circumstances, it would have attracted no particular attention. Families navigated such matters regularly. Documentation was filed. Procedures were followed. Life continued, but circumstances were not normal. Because Charles and Camilla's future still entirely unspoken in any official context, still years away from becoming the subject of any public conversation, had already been considered by at least some of those closest to the royal household. And the legal documentation, if it became visible at the wrong moment, carried the potential to introduce complications that advisors feared could not be easily managed. The decision made in that room was not recorded as a decision. It was simply understood as one. The documentation would be quietly absorbed into private family records. No formal instruction would be issued. No written order would exist to trace. The matter would be handled through the particular institutional mechanism the British establishment had always understood best, not concealment through action, but concealment through deliberate inaction. A confidential internal memo was prepared shortly afterward. Deliberately brief, deliberately vague in the passages that mattered most. Distributed to no more than 3 individuals. That memo was the document Princess Anne had just read for the first time. But what happened immediately after that meeting was something none of the people in that room ever expected to become relevant again. The meeting between Princess Anne and King Charles was arranged without involving a single member of staff. No private secretary coordinated the timing. No aide confirmed the location. No entry appeared in either schedule. For 2 people whose professional lives were managed with extraordinary precision, the absence of any formal arrangement was itself a signal, an indication that what needed to be said could not be allowed to pass through the usual channels. Anne arrived carrying the folder. Charles was already in the room when she entered. He stood near the window, his posture composed in the particular way that suggested he had been preparing himself for the last several hours. He had received her communication. He understood the general nature of what she had found. But understanding something in outline and confronting it directly across a room are entirely different experiences, and both of them knew it. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way that silences between strangers can be. It was the silence of 2 people who have shared enough history to understand that some conversations require a moment before they can begin. Anne placed the folder on the table without preamble. She did not offer context. She did not soften the introduction. She simply opened it to the relevant page and turned it toward him. Charles looked down. He read without speaking. His expression remained controlled throughout the lifetime of public discipline that royal life demands does not disappear in private moments, simply because the stakes are personal. But Anne watched him carefully. She had known her brother for the entirety of her life. She understood the particular quality of stillness that settled over him when something genuinely disturbed him. She saw it now. When he finished, he did not immediately respond. He closed the folder with the same deliberate care with which he handled most things and placed his hands flat on the table. Another silence followed, longer this time. Then he asked a question that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. He asked whether Anne believed the suppression had been specifically authorized, or whether it was possible the matter had been managed below the level of formal royal knowledge by advisors acting on assumptions rather than explicit instruction. The question told Anne something important. It told her that Charles was not entirely surprised, not by the existence of the documentation, not by the fact that a decision had been made during that period to handle the matter quietly. What appeared to unsettle him was the specific evidence now sitting between them, the confirmation, in writing, that the decision had been more deliberate and more formally understood than he may have previously believed. Anne answered him directly. The memo, she explained, did not read like the work of advisors exceeding their authority. It read like the work of people operating entirely within it. Charles said nothing for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, he asked only one further question, not about the document itself, but about who else within the current household might have access to records from that period. Anne recognized the instinct immediately. It was not obstruction. It was the trained reflex of someone who understood that information. Once it begins moving, rarely stops at the destination originally intended. Yet neither of them realized the most important question was not what had been hidden, but who had decided to keep it hidden, and why. The palace did not panic. It never did. That was perhaps the most misunderstood quality of the British monarchy as an institution. The capacity to absorb crisis without visibly registering it. Centuries of political turbulence, public scandal, and private devastation had produced something that functioned less like a family organization and more like a carefully engineered system designed to outlast every force that threatened it. When something dangerous entered that system, the response was never emotional. It was procedural. Within 48 hours of Charles and Anne's private conversation, a small number of individuals had been quietly briefed, not many. The circle was deliberately narrow. Senior private secretaries, a legal advisor whose discretion had been tested across multiple decades of royal service, one communications official whose particular skill lay not in crafting public statements, but in determining which situations required no public statement at all. They gathered without fanfare. No formal agenda was circulated. No minutes would be taken. The meeting existed in the same category as the original decision made 30 years earlier, understood by those present, invisible to everyone else. The first question placed before the group was straightforward. What, precisely, did the documentation establish? The legal advisor spoke carefully. The memo confirmed that a decision had been made during the relevant period to absorb sensitive family documentation without formal disclosure. Whether that decision constituted a breach of any specific royal obligation depended on a series of procedural questions that would require further examination of records from that era. The second question followed immediately. Did anyone currently within the household have knowledge of the original decision beyond what the memo itself revealed? The answer was less straightforward. Several individuals who had occupied relevant positions during the early 1990s were still alive. Some remained connected to royal circles in various capacities. Others had retired entirely from public life. Whether any of them retained specific knowledge of the matter or had maintained silence about it across 3 decades was something that could not be determined from the documents alone. The communications official then introduced the consideration that sharpened everyone's attention. If this story reached the press without a controlled response already in place, the palace would lose the ability to shape how it was understood. Journalists familiar with royal affairs would not simply report the existence of the documentation. They would construct a narrative around it, and that narrative, assembled from fragments of evidence and informed speculation, would be far more damaging than any carefully managed institutional acknowledgement could ever be. The room absorbed that observation in silence. What followed was a discussion that lasted several hours. Options were examined, risks were assessed. Historical precedents were referenced quietly, precisely, without sentiment. By the end of the meeting, 2 things had been agreed upon. The first was that a formal internal review would be established under strict confidentiality protocols. Its scope would be limited. Its membership would be small. Its findings would not be made public unless the situation developed in ways that made continued silence untenable. The second was that the documentation itself would be secured under new archival protocols immediately. As the group dispersed, one senior advisor paused briefly at the door. He said nothing further, but the expression he carried out of that room was the expression of someone who understood that the machinery had already begun moving, and once it moved, there would be no quiet way to stop it. The internal review produced its most significant finding on a Thursday morning. Nobody had expected it to arrive so quickly. The team assembled to examine the historical records had been given a cautious timeline, weeks, not days. The volume of archival material from that period was considerable, and the instruction to work without drawing attention made progress necessarily slow. Yet sometimes the most important discoveries do not require exhaustive searching. Sometimes they are simply waiting in the precise location where someone left them, decades earlier, under the assumption that nobody would ever think to look. What the review uncovered changed the entire shape of the story. The suppressed documentation did not reveal wrongdoing by Camilla herself. There was no scandal in the conventional sense, no hidden relationship, no secret of the kind that tabloid coverage of the royal family had conditioned the public to expect. What it revealed was something considerably more uncomfortable, precisely because it implicated not one person, but an entire system of decision-making that extended far beyond any individual. The documents established that a member of Camilla's extended family had, during the early 1990s, completed a quiet but formal legal process with direct dynastic implications. The process itself was entirely legitimate, properly conducted, correctly documented. There was nothing irregular about the action itself. What was irregular was the decision to ensure that documentation of it disappeared from any institutional record accessible to royal officials responsible for assessing the constitutional landscape around Charles's future, because those officials had already, by that point, begun quietly considering what a future between Charles and Camilla might require, and the legal documentation, had it remained visible, would have introduced a formal procedural question not insurmountable, but requiring official examination into a situation that certain senior advisors had already determined must proceed without complication. The suppression, in other words, had not been designed to protect Camilla from embarrassment. It had been designed to protect a future that powerful people had already decided was necessary. The distinction was devastating in its implications, because it meant the concealment was not reactive. It was not the panicked response of individuals trying to contain an unexpected problem. It was a calculated institutional act carried out by people who believed they understood what the monarchy required better than the processes designed to govern it. It meant that at least some of those closest to the royal family during that period had looked at the documentation, assessed its implications, and made a deliberate choice to remove it from consideration, not because it revealed anything disgraceful, but because it represented an obstacle to an outcome they had already concluded was inevitable. When Princess Anne received the summary of these findings, she sat with it for a long time before responding. The review team waited. Her eventual reply contained only one observation, precise, measured, and carrying the full weight of everything she had understood since opening that folder. She noted that the people who made the original decision had not acted to protect Camilla. They had acted to protect their own vision of what the monarchy should become, and Camilla herself, it was now becoming impossible to ignore, may never have been told. But one final meeting had not yet taken place. One conversation remained between the woman who discovered the truth and the woman it concerned most. The meeting was never entered into any official schedule. It was arranged through a single private communication, brief, direct, and entirely unmediated by the usual layers of royal household coordination. No private secretaries were involved in the planning. No aides confirmed the timing. The location chosen was familiar to both women, but sufficiently removed from the daily rhythm of palace life to ensure that whatever passed between them would remain exactly where it belonged. Between them, Princess Anne arrived without the folder. That decision had not been accidental. She had considered bringing the documentation, had even placed it on the table beside her before leaving, thinking it might be necessary to have the physical evidence present. Then she had left it behind, because what she needed to say did not require paper to support it, and because arriving with a folder felt less like a conversation and more like an accusation. Whatever this meeting needed to be, it could not begin that way. Queen Camilla was already seated when Anne entered. Her posture was composed, characteristically so. The quality of composure that Camilla had developed over decades of navigating public life, under conditions that would have exhausted most people, a composure built not from coldness but from the particular discipline of someone had learned, through long experience, that visible emotion in the wrong moment carries its own kind of cost. But beneath it, Anne noticed something, a tension that Camilla had not quite managed to conceal entirely. Not fear, precisely. Something more like the expression of a person who has been waiting for a conversation they always suspected would eventually arrive, and who is not entirely certain they are prepared for it now that it has. Anne sat down. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Anne began. She did not use the language of investigation or institutional review. She did not reference legal implications or archival findings or the carefully worded summary produced by the internal team. She spoke plainly about what the documents established, about the decision made 30 years earlier, about what that decision had been designed to achieve, and crucially, about what the evidence now suggested regarding who had authorized it. Camilla listened without interrupting. Her expression did not collapse. It did not harden. It shifted in the particular way that faces shift when someone is absorbing information that simultaneously confirms a long-held uncertainty and exceeds the specific form they had imagined it taking. Because the most significant thing Anne told her was not that the suppression had occurred. It was that the people responsible had acted without Camilla's knowledge. That distinction settled into the room slowly. Camilla had spent years aware that her path into the royal family had been managed with extraordinary institutional care. She had understood, without requiring explicit confirmation, that powerful people had made decisions on her behalf during that period. That was simply the nature of the world she had entered. What she had not known, what she now understood for the first time, was the precise extent to which those decisions had involved the deliberate removal of information that affected her own family directly. The silence that followed was long. Then Camilla asked only one question. She asked whether the people responsible had genuinely believed they were acting in her interest. Anne did not answer immediately. She looked at the woman across from her, at the composure still held carefully in place, at the weight now visible beneath it, and understood that the honest answer was both yes and no, and that neither answer was sufficient. The institutional decision had already been made, but the emotional truth between these two women would take far longer to settle. The first indication that something had escaped palace control arrived without warning. It always did. That was the particular cruelty of institutional information management. The effort invested in containing a story bore no reliable relationship to how long that containment would hold. Weeks of careful internal procedure could be undone in hours by a single conversation in the wrong location, overheard by the wrong person, repeated once to someone who understood its significance. Nobody ever identified precisely where the breach occurred. It hardly mattered. By the time communications officials became aware that fragments of the story were circulating within certain press circles, the process had already moved beyond the point where source identification would have changed anything meaningful. The earliest coverage was cautious, deliberately imprecise, the kind of journalism that signals awareness of a larger story without yet possessing enough confirmed detail to commit to its full dimensions. Royal correspondents from two major British publications filed pieces that circled the subject with the practiced care of writers who understood both the significance of what they were approaching and the legal and professional consequences of approaching it incorrectly. The pieces asked questions rather than providing answers. That was often more damaging. Questions, once published, acquire their own momentum. They invite speculation from those who believe they know part of the answer. They encourage sources to surface who might otherwise have remained silent. They create a public appetite that subsequent reporting then feels obligated to satisfy. Within 72 hours, the story had crossed into international coverage. European publications approached it with less restraint than their British counterparts. American outlets contextualized it through the particular lens their audiences applied to anything involving the British royal family. A combination of fascination, skepticism, and the comfortable silences of observers who feel entitled to strong opinions about an institution they will never be required to defend. Australian and Canadian coverage reflected the additional complexity of nations where the monarchy retained constitutional relevance and therefore carried consequences beyond the merely symbolic. Television panels assembled with remarkable speed. Royal commentators who had spent careers cultivating access to palace-adjacent sources appeared across multiple networks within the same news cycle. Their analysis ranged from the carefully measured to the openly speculative. Several came remarkably close to the specific details of what had actually occurred. Whether through genuine sourcing or informed extrapolation was impossible to determine from the outside. Public debate formed along lines that felt simultaneously familiar and newly charged. Those who had always maintained reservations about the institution found in the emerging story confirmation of suspicions they had long carried. Those who defended the monarchy argued that private family matters, even those with institutional dimensions, deserved protection from the relentless appetite of public scrutiny. The argument between them was not new, but the specific context gave it a sharpness that ordinary royal coverage rarely produced. The palace issued a statement on the fourth day. It was a masterwork of careful language. Precise enough to avoid obvious falsehood. Vague enough to confirm nothing. Structured in the particular way that official royal communications are structured when the primary objective is not to inform, but to interrupt a narrative without visibly doing so. Observers noted one significant absence. The statement made no mention of Princess Anne. Yet through all of it, one moment would come to define exactly what the monarchy chose to show the world and what it chose to hide. The engagement had been scheduled for weeks. A formal church service at a location deeply embedded in royal tradition. The kind of occasion that exists simultaneously as religious observance and institutional statement, where the act of appearing carries meaning entirely independent of anything said or done during the event itself. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have attracted respectful coverage and modest public attendance. A familiar gathering of familiar faces, noted and recorded, and quickly absorbed into the continuous flow of royal calendar events. These were not ordinary circumstances. By the morning of the service, the press presence outside had grown to a size that made the occasion feel considerably less routine. Camera positions had been established hours earlier. Correspondents delivered their preliminary pieces to morning audiences across multiple countries. The collective attention directed toward what should have been an unremarkable Thursday engagement carried the particular intensity that develops when the public understands, without being explicitly told, that something significant is about to be communicated not through words, but through the language the monarchy has always spoken most fluently. Presence, proximity, positioning. King Charles arrived first. His bearing was precisely what those who observed him regularly would have recognized: the contained dignity of a man who has spent his entire life understanding that every public movement is also a public statement. He acknowledged those gathered outside with the measured warmth his engagements typically produced. Nothing in his manner suggested distraction. Nothing indicated that the previous weeks had placed any unusual pressure on the composure he presented to the world. Then Queen Camilla appeared. The cameras tracked her with the focused attention of lenses that understood their purpose that morning was not simply documentation but interpretation. She moved with characteristic grace, the unhurried confidence of a woman who had learned, across many years of public life, that the most effective response to scrutiny is the complete refusal to appear aware of it. She took her position beside Charles without visible hesitation. The analysts watching through long lenses noted every detail. Then Princess Anne arrived. The moment that would be replayed across international broadcasts for days afterward lasted approximately 4 seconds. As Anne approached the entrance, Camilla turned. The movement appeared entirely natural, the instinctive acknowledgement of someone arriving rather than a choreographed gesture designed for observation. What followed was brief, a look exchanged between the two women that carried none of the visible tension the press had been preparing its audiences to witness. Instead, something considerably more understated passed between them. Camilla inclined her head slightly. Anne responded with a look that those who knew her well would have recognized as the closest her particular emotional register ever came to warmth. Then both women turned and entered the building. The moment lasted no longer than a breath. yet it was sufficient. Body language analysts retained by 3 separate television networks offered nearly identical readings within hours of the footage circulating. Whatever had passed between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla in private had not produced the fracture the coverage had been anticipating. It had produced something more complicated and considerably more interesting. An understanding. Not resolution, not the erasure of everything the preceding weeks had uncovered, but the visible evidence of 2 people who had sat across from each other in a room with the full weight of 30 years between them and had chosen, despite everything, to continue. The public received no explanation. The image itself was the statement, and what followed in the weeks afterward would reveal whether that single moment represented a genuine turning point or simply the most elegant way the monarchy had ever learned to appear unchanged. The internal review concluded quietly. No press conference announced its completion. No official summary was released to the public. The findings were transmitted in written form to the most senior figures within the royal household, and then secured under archival protocols that ensured they would not surface again through ordinary institutional channels. For those who had hoped the process might produce some form of public accountability, the conclusion was predictably unsatisfying. For those who had feared it might produce something considerably more disruptive, it represented exactly the outcome the machinery had been designed to deliver. Controlled, contained, concluded. The individuals who had made the original decision 30 years earlier were not named in any public context. One had died several years prior. Another had long since withdrawn from any connection to royal affairs and was, by all accounts, in poor health. The third remained active in a private capacity, present enough within certain circles to be aware of how the review had ended, and quiet enough to ensure that awareness remained entirely his own. The archivists who had been present during the original discovery were reassigned to different institutional responsibilities within weeks. The reassignment was framed in entirely routine terms. Nobody who received the notification would have found reason to question it. Princess Anne returned to her schedule. Those who observed her across the months that followed described something subtle but consistent. A quality of deliberateness that had always been present in her public manner, but now seemed slightly more considered, as though each engagement carried a weight of private context that her external composure was required to accommodate without acknowledging. She gave nothing away. She never did. But the people who knew her best understood that something had shifted in the architecture of how she moved through the world. Queen Camilla continued her duties with the composure that had come to define her public identity entirely. Yet those closest to her noticed a change that was difficult to articulate precisely. A seriousness that had not previously been quite so consistently present. Not sadness, not anger. Something more like the settled gravity of a person who has received information that permanently altered their understanding of their own history and has chosen to carry that alteration privately, rather than allow it to become part of any public narrative. King Charles made one small alteration to a forthcoming royal engagement. Most observers missed it entirely. It concerned a matter of protocol so minor that it generated no commentary in any coverage of the event. But those who understood the backstory recognized it immediately for what it was: a quiet, unannounced acknowledgement that something had changed. Not a grand gesture, not a formal statement, simply the kind of small, deliberate act through which the monarchy has always communicated the things it cannot bring itself to say directly. The story faded from public attention, the way most royal stories eventually do, gradually replaced by newer events, newer controversies, newer cycles of fascination and outrage and forgetting. Yet what it left behind resisted the usual process of fading, because the fundamental question it raised was not about Camilla's family, or Princess Anne's discovery, or the decisions made in a private room 3 decades earlier. It was about the cost of protecting an institution by deciding, on behalf of the people within it, which truths they were permitted to know about their own lives. And no internal review, however thorough, could answer that. The most enduring lesson the monarchy never intended to teach was the simplest one: that silence, maintained long enough and carefully enough, eventually becomes its own kind of confession.